major part of warfare in a practical sense. Chariots were, however, a very strong symbolic element of the elite. So elites depicted themselves in chariots. And of course, this is something that they extracted from the East, from places like Egypt, where chariots were actually practical tools of warfare.
The elites of the late Bronze Age may have possessed powerful weapons and controlled large armies, but it wasn't enough to save their empires. In the end, their greatest enemy was an unexpected one that led to the collapse of the ancient world.
I would argue that the collapse of the late Bronze Age was so calamitous and so catastrophic that a similarity would not be seen again until Rome collapsed, which is 1,500 years later.
In the late Bronze Age, you have these large kingdoms that dominated the whole region. It wasn't an era of city-states so much anymore like the early Bronze Age was. The late Bronze Age already, you have large regional states, even nation-states you could call them.
These nation-states were highly sophisticated and urbanized, bolstered by a thriving international trade network and the spoils of war. Yet they were vulnerable to numerous threats.
None of these societies were really built to last a long time. They had kind of inherent fragilities and weaknesses that would sooner or later come to tell on them.
No one knows exactly why Bronze Age civilizations collapsed the way they did, but their highly stratified societies may have been a factor. One theory points to a growing inequality between the ruling elites and their dependents. Overtaxation, poverty, and oppression sparked internal dissent. People began to flee their kingdoms, seeking refuge in other lands and causing unrest throughout the region.
They were clearly posing a problem to the rulers, to the settled society, the elites of the late Bronze Age. Sometimes there's treaties between the different kings of the late Bronze Age, and the treaties include clauses about fugitives. How if a fugitive from your kingdom comes into mine, then I am liable to send them back to you. So clearly there's a problem that these rulers are dealing with people that are running away all the time.
Another theory adds climate change to the mix. During the end of the late Bronze Age, there is increasing evidence that the climate was much drier, and drought became a persistent issue.
Agriculture in Greece is something which is always a struggle in terms of rainfall and would have been potentially precarious. And one of the suggestions that scholars are kind of working with now is that if they were to have several bad seasons in a row during one of these dry spells, I mean, think of a moment like the Dust Bowl here in the States, what you end up having is the basis of these societies, what we all cannot do without. Food starts to become a scarce resource.
If you didn't have the same supplies of water that you were used to, you couldn't produce the same amount of crops and sustain the same numbers of people, particularly all those people that weren't food producers themselves, all these elites and the specialists that are working for the elites. And if the agriculture is failing, then that whole system of all these parasitical people that are living off of the actual farmers and herders and so forth, that's all going to fall apart if they can't be fed.
While drought and famine may have helped topple these Bronze Age societies, it's possible the land itself created even more instability. There's evidence that powerful earthquakes once rocked the region.
Mainland Greece and the islands are a site of high seismic activity. They're right on a fault line, and so there are frequent earthquakes. The palaces were producing large quantities of olive oil and large quantities of wine and storing them in these giant pithos jars as tall as you or I, full of oil. And you combine that with lamps that would have been inside, like candles burning, earthquake, and these large drums of oil, and you get this recipe for disaster.
By the end of the 13th century BC, it was clear that many of the ruling elites were hitting a crisis point.
We see in text that people are writing letters back and forth to one another. So, for example, we hear evidence that there are groups that are attacking Cyprus. We also hear this from various different places along the Levantine coast and from Egypt itself. So this is the so-called Sea Peoples.
No one knows exactly where the Sea People